Can everybody hear me all right? Yeah. Feel free to challenge me on anything that I say during this presentation. Okay, I mean, this is a draft regulation that's being provided to us. I've not spoken to any ministries or officials regarding this. The thoughts that I'm going to be expressing are based on my reading of the draft regulation. So if you have a different perspective, or if you have a different way of seeing things, and then what I'm going to be discussing, please do not hesitate to mention that. And I'm open to all comments and other interpretations and so on. At this time, I think that it's more of a collective effort that we're doing here. And my presentation is just to maybe sort of structure the reflection or the discussion on this. The thing that we have to keep in mind here is that we are talking about the règlement d'application de la loi sur l'enseignement privé, so the regulation that applies the law. So this is not a change to the law. Okay, the Private Education Act is not being amended by this change or these changes. It is the regulation applying the law that is being changed. Okay, so that means that whatever is in the law remains the same. The law is not changing. Okay, so we need to keep that in mind. It doesn't mean that this is inconsequential. Quite the contrary. There's a lot of stuff in here, and it is going to have an impact on you. But it's not the law that's changing. Okay, so we have to keep that in mind. What I've done is I've prepared a little document that sort of compares the current version of the regulation with the text that they have put in this new regulation. Now, I have this in French. Okay, so we're gonna have to look at it in French today. I don't think that that's a problem for any of you, but I just want to let you know that I will have an English version prepared. Okay, and then I'll circulate afterwards. But just for the sake of speed today, I had to prepare this in French. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share the screen so that you can see this.
Thank you for that, Patrick. It's really appreciated, even of a touch point.
I just want to make sure that I'm sharing the right thing. This should be it. Yes. Okay, so does everybody see a note de service on BLG letterhead?
No.
Do you see that?
No.
No?
Yes.
We're good to go.
Now you see it? Okay. All right. So it was only in my discussion with Holly that that she mentioned to me that the whole issue of the security is a concern for some of you, and what the regulation is providing. So I didn't actually put the provisions regarding security in here because I didn't think that that was going to be a major concern. But I understand that there are some people who are concerned that maybe the changes that have been made through this regulation mean that you are going to be required to provide a much more significant security as per the regulation, and that you are going to have to essentially provide that amount yourselves, cash, have that cash made available with the ministry. That's not quite what's happening. Okay, what's going to be happening with respect to the security is, yes, the regulation as it currently stood basically sort of looked at only the amount of tuition that schools charged, and then said if you have X amount of tuition per year, you're going to have a security of X amount. Okay, and the maximum security under the current regulation was $100,000 for anybody who had $500,000 or more of tuition. Okay, it was maxed out at $100,000. The new regulation increases significantly the security that schools can be required to provide. Okay. And it also, and this is the more significant aspect of it, it changes on the basis on which the calculation is made to determine how much security a school has to provide. So, for example, let's take a very simple example. Whereas before, if a school had 10 students, okay, it would say, well, we charge $4,000 in tuition or whatever the base amount is there from the, let's say we're talking about a school in Mexico. Oh, sorry, one important point to make. Security is only required for schools that don't have the subsidy. Okay, you have a subsidy, you don't need to provide security. Okay, the law, the regulation is correct. But for schools that don't have subsidies, okay, you have to provide the security. And the security is calculated now in a different way in that it doesn't just look at the tuition that a school charges, it looks at everything that a school charges per student, okay, including accessory fees. So coming back to the example that I was mentioning, before you were charging $4,000 in tuition, for example, and you had 10 students, well, then you would say, okay, we have $40,000 that we charge of tuition revenue, and therefore we pay. You go and look at the scale that's applicable to you when you charge 40,000 tuition, and you say, okay, we have to provide security of $20,000, and good, that's all fine. Now, that same school that has 10 students, they would have to include in the amount not just the 4,000 of tuition, but the 4,000 of tuition, accessory fees, admission fees, the whole thing. So it may be that it's $20,000 per student. So therefore, you're not just looking at $40,000. You're looking at a school that has $200,000 if they have 10 students of revenues, and you have to look at how much security you need to provide for a school that has $200,000 of revenue. Okay, so that's how this is really changing the game, and also you see it there in the regulation. You can be required to provide the maximum amount of security maxes out at a school that has 25 million in revenues, essentially. So really, they've changed the scale significantly in terms of determining how much security you need to provide. Okay, and the thing is, under the regulation, though, you will still be able to essentially sort of purchase that security via the ministry. They've taken out the second option that you used to have to provide that security, which was the option where it was a formula provided under the Civil Code of Quebec and so on. But essentially, you can either provide the security by essentially having the dropping off the cash with the ministry directly. If your security is $125,000, well, you provide a $125,000 check to the ministry, and they hold on to that money. Or you can also provide that security through the whole procedure that they mention in the regulation there, and so you can essentially buy that security. So it's another way of doing it. Okay, so those are the main changes that I see here with respect to security. Anybody have any questions here?
Patrick, I have a quick question for you that has come up. The difference between elementary schools and secondary schools, and then the K to 11, and also one other question after that, which I will get to. So, for example, our non-subsidized schools, we have secondary schools that receive a subsidy. We have secondary schools that don't receive a subsidy. Elementary schools historically don't receive a subsidy. So my layperson understanding is that they would then fall under those new rules as well.
That's a good question. That's a good question, Holly. If somebody who is in that situation could maybe tell us, a school that is subsidized for high school and not subsidized for the elementary school, have they provided the security in under the current system, under the current rules?
Just 1 second. Does anyone have an idea?
Does anybody know whether or not they've provided security when they're in that context? I think I'll have to get back to you on that point, Holly. I don't know how that's being handled.
Okay, and then one other question. Yeah, I mean, they do have separate codes, you know, for example, an elementary school would be an 001 of the institution, the secondary will be the 002. So they are sort of treated as separate entities in some ways, but some clarification there I think would be definitely helpful and something some of our schools will definitely be looking for. The other question is, would this apply to, say, an extra educational program, say, for example, a grade 12 year, where it is run as, say, a separate legal entity? It's not part of that K-11 system, not subject to subsidy either. You know, so.
No, I don't think it would apply to that. My understanding is that the ministry sort of doesn't really sort of like acknowledge officially the existence of grade 12 programs and doesn't see grade 12 programs as being under its purview.
Yeah.
So if the ministry were to say, well, no, you have to include grade 12 revenues in this calculation, that would sort of legitimize grade 12 in my view. So I'd be very surprised if the ministry would consider that those amounts have to be included. It would not be logical for them to do that.
Right. Okay, thanks, that helps. And that's in line with the feedback I've gotten from the ministry as well, that it's outside of the.
Yeah.
Thanks, Patrick.
Okay, any other questions about security?
Yes, I do. Hi, Alex from Selwyn House. So the question is the mechanism to provide the security. I'm new to the education world, but in past experiences, we would often bid on government contracts and so on, and we would provide bid bonds. Like this was, and those could be provided by any insurer or anyone that would support us to provide those bid bonds. It sounds, Patrick, like you're saying that that is not possible, that we have to go through the mechanism that is outlined by the government.
Yes, you really do have to go by the mechanism that is provided for by the government. Just let me go and get the exact text of that. So okay. So, you know, you're going to be allowed to furnish the security by what they have at points 1 and 3. So point 1 right now is by means of a guarantee policy in favor of the minister, according to the form prescribed as Schedule B, and issued by a company authorized to stand CERTI in Quebec. So I think that that's pretty much along the lines of what you were mentioning, Alex. Okay.
Okay, so that allows us to get competitive rates.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Okay. And of course, the second way is that the school just puts the cash with the ministry, right? But not always very interesting. Okay. Any other questions? I can't see everyone at once here, so I just have to make sure that.
I'll keep you posted, Patrick.
There we go. Good. I'm on gallery view now, so I know I'm able to see it.
So Patrick, I have a follow-up question. So this is draft right now. Do we know when this will come into effect?
Yes, it's presently it is scheduled to come into effect on the 1st of July 2023. Okay, is when it's scheduled to come into effect. So what they do is they publish a draft regulation like this, and then they give people the opportunity to provide comments on the draft regulation. You have 45 days from the time where it was published, and then after that, the regulation will be adopted, and then will come into force. So it could come in later, but if there's a lot of changes, if people request a lot of changes to the regulation, but I don't think that they will be allowing many changes here. I find that, just as a general comment, I find that this regulation is a regulation that's going to add to your paperwork and administrative duties quite significantly. And I find it funny that, coming from the CAC government that's always saying, no, we got to cut red tape and make things less demanding from an administrative perspective for small and medium-sized businesses. I find it interesting that they're, pushing this regulation through, which is going to complicate things to a certain degree for everyone, especially in the first year, where or the first time that people are going to have to comply with all of these new requirements. But that's more of an editorial comment than a legal analysis of it. I think that there's going to be some additional administrative duties here for all of you, additional paperwork and paper pushing and accounting instead of this new regulation. Okay, so then what I was proposing is just very quickly go through, sort of some of the major elements that we're seeing. So what you have in the left-hand column is the current text of the regulation as it stands now, and what you have in the right-hand column is the proposed amendments that were published in the Gazette in early March. Okay, so as I've just explained, what is proposed for the change to Article 10 of the current regulation is the way they're going to calculate the school revenues, essentially for the purpose of determining the security. So before, it was just the droit de scolarité, la somme des revenus des droits de scolarité. So they would just look at tuition fees. Now they're going to be looking at droit de scolarité and everything related to frais d'admission et d'inscription et services accessoires. Okay, so that's the big change for the change in the formula to determine how much security schools will be required to provide. Again, if you're subsidized, you don't need to worry about this, and I'll answer also with respect to schools that have half and half, subsidized, not subsidized. And then after that, the change to how the security can be provided, they are removing this second option here, which I'm not very familiar with. It was just another way of providing the security. They're removing that option now. And so you have just the option that I mentioned a few seconds ago in responding to Alex's question, which is to deal with a company that's going to provide the security, or the school itself can provide the security directly by providing the cash to the ministry. Okay. And then after that, the change that's provided at Section 12 is again with respect to security. They're modifying the text in line with the change that they have done at Article 11. Article 14. Here they are again. It's along with the issue of security, and this paragraph 2 here is being removed from Article 14, and it relates to what happens when a school doesn't reimburse a student, and how the security can be used. And so, not something that happens very frequently, so I don't want to spend too much time on this. Now then, they have added a new Article 16, okay, 16.1, I'm sorry, to the regulation. So the regulation currently has an Article 16. They've added a new Article 16.1, which deals with changement d'un administrateur, d'un actionnaire, ou d'un dirigeant, in that you're going to be required to provide a notice to that effect with certain documents. Okay, something that doesn't happen too often, but just they're clarifying the regulation with respect to what happens when you have a change of directors, director, shareholder, or officer within the school. Okay, so I'm not going to spend too much time talking about that either. More administrative in nature. Now then, I think this is something that everybody is a little bit concerned with, is what's happening with publicity, contracts, offer for services. Okay, what is this section, these changes to section 17 of the regulation going to mean? Okay, and I think that's something that's of concern for everyone. So the main change here, from my reading of the regulation, is that the ministry essentially wants schools to provide a lot more detail and a lot more clarity to parents, or to potential parents, potential clients, regarding the nature of the services offered by the schools and the amounts charged for those services. Okay, essentially what the government is saying is, when the school advertises in any way, especially in written advertising, you need to provide more information. And when you send out an offer for services, you basically have to include all the information that used to be included in a educational services contract. Okay? So essentially, when a parent is deciding whether or not to send their kids to your school, they want that parent to pretty much know everything, so that there are no essentially surprises when they get the educational services contract. That's my reading. Does anybody have a different reading? That's really how I see these changes that are being proposed to Article 17. Anybody have a different view on that? No? Okay.
So Patrick,
So, yeah.
sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
One of the questions I had was, at what point do you articulate those things? The question I had from a couple of people was, if we're participating in things like, for example, the Gazette education supplement, do we need to disclose all that there? It sounds like it's pretty clear what you're talking about is really that moment of engagement when we're presenting that contract, not just in terms of general publicity and things like that.
No, I think that in terms of, and they do make a distinction between, tout établissement doit mentionner dans toute publicité, offre de service ou sollicitation qu'il fait, they need to provide the information that you have here. So address of the establishment, email address, website, telephone number, le code du programme visé, and then quelle est l'obtention d'un diplôme, d'un certificat, you've got these, sorry, this should be down here. So you've got these different elements that you need to mention, okay? That's in all publicité, offre de service ou sollicitation qu'il fait. So, just one second.
And then, of course, we'll be talking to you at a later point about what needs to be in French and what needs to be in English where. That'll be fun.
Yes, that's a whole other topic and another interesting topic. But I just want to clarify here. So in all publicities, you need to provide this. So that means, for example, a radio publicity, a television publicity, whatever, any publicity you need to have is le nom et les services éducatifs et les titres des programmes visés. That needs to be provided any kind of publicity. As soon as the publicity is in writing, par écrit, you need to provide what's in at points 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, that's what you need to provide when you're doing a written publicity, offre de service, offer of services, or solicitation. Okay. Then they added 17.1. Okay. And 17.1 is every offer for services, okay, needs to contain all of the following information, and that's what you have at 1 here, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. This is basically all the stuff that you had in your educational services contract. Okay, it's pretty much as simple as that, because now, as we'll see in a few seconds, when you go and look at what the content of an educational services contract is, it's a few things, but essentially it has to include everything that you have at 17 and 17.1. So the content of the educational services contract is basically the content, has to include all the content of an offer for service. So you see how the government is saying these two documents essentially sort of speak to each other. They need to correlate perfectly together. Essentially, when you're making an offer of services, you need to have in there all the information that you have in your contract for educational services. There should be no surprises for the parent at the time where they've made their choice. They've told you, yes, okay, I want to send my child to your school. And then they're sort of locked in. Then all of a sudden they get an educational services contract and they're like, wow, okay, that's not what I thought I was going to have to pay, or that's not what I thought the services were going to be, or that's, basically no surprises. That's the logic that I see behind what they've done.
So Patrick, just a quick question. So what is an offer of service if not a contract?
Yeah. That's a good question. It's not entirely clear to me. I think that basically, for example, if you send a parent sort of a school brochure that says, this is our school, this is the services that we offer, this is, here are some pictures of our classrooms and sports programs and that's great. You can put all that stuff in your brochure, but you also have to include all of the information that you've got here at 17, 17.1.
Oh.
Don't just send the glossy brochure with the nice pictures and stuff and without providing all the information that you have. So for me,
so that's an interesting distinction then. That's a bit beyond just here we're at the contract stage. Here's the contract, you need to know the breakdown. That seems to be more of a promotional step where that's being requested. Okay. Exactly.
It's because they say offer of services or solicitation. I mean, for me, when you're sending, an offer of services, it's different from, they use the terms publicity, offer for services, solicitation. So clearly, offer for services has to be something else than just a publicity. And so I think that when a school sends to parents, a form to fill out, say, hey, do you want to submit an application to have your son or daughter come to our school? And here's a nice brochure that explains what our school is about and so on. That nice brochure has to include all of the information that is spelled out.
May I ask a question? Lily Lefebvre, Sacred Heart School of Montreal. Would that, if I'm understanding correctly, then that would also include our websites?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well,
that's a good question, though. Would it, Patrick?
Because we are promoting and offering services, if by your definition, on our websites.
Yeah.
Well, you can we not say we're informing? It's Kathy from Draft. Can't we say we're informing? I mean, I can see for our open houses, right? Anytime we give out brochures.
Exactly. Yes.
Because that's a promotion. But a website could just be an identification and a brand. You're not saying.
I think it will be worthwhile to ask the ministry to provide us clarification on that specific issue. That's a good question.
We also have, I just want to ask, is an acceptance letter considered an offer of service? So parent applies, you're sending them an acceptance letter saying you have been accepted to this school. Would you also need to include the breakdown at that point, or would they have needed to see that breakdown at a point previous to that in the admissions flow?
It depends how the process is done with the school, but I would think that certainly where the school is saying, you know, your child is admitted, is accepted to the school, with that certainly, in my view, qualifies as an offer of services, and that should include all the information at that point that you have here.
The other question we've had directly related to that is grade 12 publicity. So,
Grade 12 doesn't exist.
right, perfect, great.
From my perspective, that's the way the ministry sees it, and so there's no regulations, there's no legal framework around grade 12.
Okay.
So, unless anybody has a different perspective on this, which I'm happy to discuss, that's the way I see it.
Yvette, did you have another question, or was that the?
Yeah, no, I'm good. That was my questions for grade 12, if that was applying to grade 12.
Yeah. For now, I think we can dodge that bullet.
I'm thinking that the ministry is going to tell us that the website is an offer of services, but we'll check.
So you're leaning in that direction, that
Yeah.
website would be grouped as an
Yeah.
offer of service?
Yeah, I think so. Okay.
So does it indicate that we can't announce grade 12 at the same time as high school?
No, I don't think it's saying that, because again, for me, I don't see anything in here as being anything that is specifically addressing grade 12, just because, again, there's no legal framework around grade 12. So and I was asking myself that question as I was reading through it. Is there anything in here that could, clearly be an indication that they're saying that grade 12 is not going to be permissible, or is not, permissible or authorized or whatever? And I don't see it in here. Yeah, I don't see it in this text.
It's Lise from WIC. I just wanted to add, I was comparing this version with the old version, and I did see something that said de faire mention d'un programme d'études ou d'un service éducatif non mentionné au permis. So I'm assuming that means if your grade 12 program is not within your permit, then you couldn't advertise the grade 12 on your school advertising. But that was in the older version.
Yeah.
It doesn't say that clause was removed. It's just something I saw in the old version.
Yes, and yeah. So the thing is that that's always been there, and I think that the idea is that, again, it's all in terms of whatever is within the framework of the law, and grade 12 just is not within the framework of the law. It's not contemplated anywhere within the law, so it's completely outside. And so if you want to advertise that, you can. Now, I have to be careful when I talk about this, folks, because we all know that there's a very real risk here that the government is going to want to intervene and legislate with respect to grade 12, right? They said so. The minister said so in the news last summer, and they said that they're keeping an eye out on it. Some of the statements that they made didn't quite make sense, because there's one government official who said that from their perspective, grade 12 programs were not permissible or not legal or so on. The legal basis for that is unknown to me, and if it's not permissible, well, then why hasn't the government done anything to shut them down? Grade 12 programs have been around for decades. So, clearly it's all outside of the current legal framework, and so for me, when they say, you know, you can't advertise things that are not within your permit, they mean you can't advertise things that are governed by the Quebec Ministry of Education and that are not covered in your permit. So if your permit doesn't say that you can do kindergarten, well, then you can't do kindergarten. You can't advertise kindergarten. But apart from that, I don't see it as being a restriction on advertising for grade 12. Now, would it be a wise additional precaution for schools that offer grade 12 to have separate websites for that grade 12 program? Maybe. You know, it might be an additional level of protection to keep things distinct. You know, you have the elementary and high school and whatever you have a permit for, and that's on the website, and then the grade 12 is on a different website. Might be a wise thing to do. Okay, but I don't. There hasn't been any government crackdown at this point, but certainly the sense that we're getting from the ministry is that they're watching the evolution of grade 12 programs. I think that with Bill 96, the interest in having grade 12 programs is only going to increase. And so, you know, it's something they're going to be watching. Okay.
I do have a question about section 16.1, but if anybody has any more questions about 17, I don't want to interrupt that flow.
Yes.
So, question about 16.1, advising the government of changes to administrators. Is this for subsidized and nonprofit schools? Like, is this for everyone, or is this just for one group or another group?
So this is at the 16.1. Yeah.
Excellent.
And so you were wondering if this concerns only?
If it apply,
I think it applies to
all schools. So
yeah, private education establishments.
So it applies to
Sorry,
everyone.
Holly, that was my question. I was just wondering if that meant that every time there's a board member change, anytime there's a director change, do we have to advise the government, or is it just head of school? Or if it's a for-profit school, the leadership, I'm not sure who it applies to, because we have changes every year and we file a SIDREC. What I'm understanding from this is maybe there's an extra step we have to send to the government.
Yeah. So a note, essentially it says a notice of change in director, shareholder, or officer of an establishment must contain the following information and include the following documents. And then it lists all the information. So indeed, that information needs to be provided to the ministry.
Thank you.
Patrick, just to follow up on Lisa's question, like in what form does it need to be shared with the ministry?
Good question. We'll see.
It says that there's a formulaire de déclaration établi par le ministère, but I couldn't find it.
C'est tout?
Okay. I'll have to get back to you on that.
Yeah, no problem.
I don't see that here, so let me make a note of that. challenge me. Yeah, I'll have to find that. Okay, then.
Patrick,
Yes.
just a quick question, Priscilla from LCC. When we talk about the offer of service and solicitation, what happens with the financial aid letters that essentially go out before tuition rates are established for the following year? Would that fall under solicitation or offer of service? Because at that point, you'd have to change your process a little bit so that your tuition rates are known before you can send out your letters.
You mean the tuition rates for as per the base amount authorized by the ministry?
Well, there's that and the accessory fees, right? So if every year they're kind of increasing, but I mean, we send out our letters fairly early on, especially when we're talking grade 7. So it's, you know, you could say, here's a financial aid award for $10,000, but at that point, it's not known if your fees are $20,000, $22,000, $25,000. Is that, would a financial aid letter fall under this category?
What goes with a financial aid letter? What has been offered or provided to the parents at that point in terms of
usually a letter of acceptance?
Letter of acceptance is going that way.
Well, if I may add, Yvette from Sacred Heart. Can you hear me? Yeah. So in my financial aid letter for Sacred Heart, we also mention, we don't mention the tuition amount. We mention the amount of the award and that it will reduce the fees payable. But now, from what I understand, now we have to provide more details. So that means that we will need to provide the tuition amount. Is that what I'm understanding?
Yeah, because I mean, certainly if it's going out with an acceptance letter, I mean, acceptance letter is it's pretty much off this. I would think that the way to do that would be to have a note in your document that would go out that would mention that the amounts of tuition that are indicated are subject to change based on the determination of base tuition and other fees by the government or by the Ministry of Education, which normally takes place in X month or something along those lines. Okay, I would advise that, because I mean, if the government is requiring you to provide certain information, but that information is subject to change, well then, that's the best you can do. So I would recommend that you have a little note in there to that effect.
Okay, thanks.
Now then, as we've mentioned, you know, we do have the opportunity to make slight comments regarding this regulation to the Ministry of Education, and that might be a worthwhile comment making to them. So Holly, you and I can discuss that afterwards.
Patrick, just a question for you. I wonder if those schools that don't know their tuition, would it be possible for them to say the tuition for 22-23 is this with a little asterisk and say subject to change for 23-24?
Yes. But by the time where, you know, what time do you generally send out information regarding scholarships or acceptance letters? I mean, that's what time of the year is generally is that happening?
So usually it's in the fall. For example, the fall of, let's say September, October 2022 is for the kids we're accepting for September 2023.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's quite a long time
Mhm.
ahead of time. So yeah, I think that that would be certainly, and I mean, tuition does go up year over year, but not by tremendous amounts normally. It can be significant amounts, but not, double. So I think that that might be a way of doing it, but I think that this is an important concern that we should raise with the ministry about this issue, so that that can be clarified in the regulation. While we're at it, I mean, they don't change these regulations every year, thank goodness. But while we're at it, I think it would be important that there be clarity around this issue. So we can
Technically, that loophole, couldn't we use it everywhere? You put a little asterisk everywhere and say,
yeah, exactly.
Fees are subject to change, blah, blah, blah. It kind of gives us an out, no?
Yeah, it does. And I mean, I wouldn't want it to be for anything other than really like the base amount that you're allowed to charge as set by the government, because that you have absolutely no control over, to the extent that, you would then be increasing accessory services by $5,000 versus what you have announced to parent, and that I don't think would be within the spirit of the law to say, oh, well, we put an asterisk, so we told that it was subject to change. That's not what government is wanting you to do here. But I think that there has to be some provision in the regulation to account for this reality. That makes sense. Okay, so we'll make sure we get that comment to the ministry. All right. Any other questions at this point, or do we move along? Oh, for some reason my mouse is not happy. Okay. So then section 18 is modified according to what's here on the right hand side. I think that when I saw this here, specifically this text, I was wondering if this maybe wasn't related to grade 12, in the sense that I think that some schools may say to people, well, if you do grade 12 with us, it allows you to continue your studies at a Quebec unit, for example, McGill or something like that. You can continue your studies right after having completed your grade 12 with a Quebec university. Okay. So I think that when I read this here, it says, no publicity can guarantee admission to a program of study, or guarantee that anybody who registers in that program is going to complete it with success. They, can't guarantee admission. I think that you have to be careful in your grade 12 publicity that there can be nothing that can be seen there as guaranteeing. The word here is guaranteeing admission. So in your language, you have to be careful to say that, doing grade 12 here gives you the opportunity to apply for a Quebec university. When you're doing that, you're not guaranteeing admission. You're not going to say, hey, you do grade 12 here, you can go to McGill. You're saying you can apply to McGill. Okay? So that's the only tweaking that I saw that may be necessary in some language where you have, for those schools that have that offer grade 12. Here there's
in line with what we're seeing in private colleges as well, that sort of pay for play and over promising what they can deliver. And we're seeing it trickle down into our regulations as well. You don't want to be making claims that just aren't.
Exactly. Okay. So a whole new article 19.1 that is being added. Okay, 19.1 concerns the requirement to keep copies and keep records of all of the publicity, offer services, and solicitation materials that you use. And you need to hold on to that for, if I remember correctly, 7 years. L'établissement conserve. Where was it? Maybe it's in section 19 that they mentioned the 7 years. Just 1 second. Where was this section?
The 7 years sounds about right. And
Where was that?
if ever you're providing advertising or information in a language other than French or English, they really underline consistently the fact that you will also need to retain a translation in French or English of that advertising as certified to translate. So for example, if you're advertising overseas markets in a different language, then that might add another layer to our expensive.
Okay, well, somewhere it specifically said the 7 years. I can't find it right now, but essentially 19.1 is for a duration. I remember reading that it was.
So Patrick, what has changed here?
So this is all new.
This is
Okay.
all new. Okay.
Yeah, before there was just an Article 19, which said.
Again, I think the appearance of this regulation, the requests for translation specifically, are stemming from international recruiting programs, bringing people over, inferring or promising them that they will have employment and educational opportunities in Canada that they just will not have following the educational pathway that they are paying recruiters heavily for. So there's been a lot of false advertising in the private college education market, and I think we're seeing this trickle down into our regulations as well. That they're putting a bit more scrutiny on that international piece and that advertising piece, and asking us to retain that information so that we can verify if false statements or exaggerations were made in your advertising output. So
That's right. I think you're right on that, Holly. And so the current section 19 says, in any advertisement or offer of service, the institution shall specify the language in which the course is dispensed. Okay, so that's what it says now. And then they've added this 19.1 after that. Okay, which is essentially a record-keeping, data and record-keeping requirement with respect to all your publicity. And I would love to be able to find the 7-year requirement so that I can confirm that to you, but I'm not finding it for the time being, but I will find it. Okay. But
Just like, how are they going to enforce this? Like, sorry, I have an auditor background. Like,
yeah. So when they'll do a permit renewal processes,
yeah,
they'll say, hey, send me all of your publicity and so on that you used at such and such a time. Now, how are they going to be able to verify that what you're sending them is all the data and all the publicity that you use and everything? I mean, yeah. But
right.
then again, it's the requirement there. Input.
Patrick, it's Kathy Nikitas from TRAP. I just have a quick question.
Yes.
So you just said they'll be able to track it through your permit process, or will they be asking that of our auditors as they do student files and financials in the summer? Because a number of us have permits in perpetuity. I never have to do a permit renewal process. So does that? So my question is will it be an annual review as part of the audit
Mm.
process, or will it be part of permit renewal process?
That I don't know, Kathy. I really
Yeah,
don't know how they're going to handle that.
Can we
Yeah.
ask if it's a permit renewal process or an audit process?
Yeah, I mean, but permit renewal, you say you have perpetual permit, but for both levels?
For all, for this school.
For the entire school, you have a,
She's a secondary only.
Yeah,
oh, it's true, it's true, you're secondary only, that's right. Hmm. Yeah, that I don't know in what context then they'd be able to
because there's a
ask.
couple of us in that situation. Loyola's in that situation. A few more of us, I think, too. So it would be good to
Yeah.
know when and how we have to present that information.
So Alex, to give you an idea, unfortunately during permit renewal, if it is tied to permit renewal, not every school is treated equally. Some schools are subject to more scrutiny. We've seen this over and over again, receiving less length in their permit. The process varies and they demand more of some schools than others. So it could come up in they're trying to be antagonistic. It could come up because there's been an issue reported, or if it's tied to the audit, that will be interesting to see as well. But I do think it's a great question to ask Kathy, at what point is that going to be triggered? How can they track it? I mean, honestly, they probably can't, but it could be one of those things that comes up as a got you in a process.
My thought process was more in terms of completeness. So if, for the accountants to understand that language, like it's hard to demonstrate completeness in this because there's no way of proving it.
Yeah. And, reading this, they say, l'établissement conserve les informations suivantes concernant chaque publicité, offre de service et sollicitation faite. I mean, is that for every single of the service that goes out to every single parent? Or solicitation? I mean, you got to keep the records for everything that goes out to every parent, or you got to keep a sample of your offer of services that you use for a given year. Because otherwise, that's a lot of documentation. So we will ask that question as well. Okay.
Thanks, folks. These are really great questions, really helpful.
Okay. So then we get to section 20, educational services contract, the content of educational services contract. So this is where we used to have sort of the breakdown of everything that had to go into an educational services contract. The new text of it is that section 20 says the contract, educational services contract is going to have to include the complete text of what is provided at Article 14. Article 14 of the regulation is the article that says where an institution does not refund the amount it owes to a student or client because it has not met obligations, blah, blah. The minister shall refund the student himself. Okay, so all that language regarding security has to be included in the educational services contract. Okay, so the text of section 14 of the regulation has to go word for word into the educational services contract. Then you need to have all the information that you have at Article 17.1, 17.1, and 19. So all the information that we saw that has to go in the offre de service, basically, has to be included in the educational services contract. Then you have the text for Articles 70 to 75. You've always had to include that in your educational services contract. It's already there. Okay, that's the stuff about if the student wants to, or parents want to pull their kids out and refund, partial refund tuition, and all that kind of stuff. It's there. Okay, so you already have that in there. And then, oops, my mouse mentioned that l'établissement s'engage à ne pas céder ou vendre le présent contrat. That was already in there. And then a line directly below it for the parents to sign to confirm that they've seen and read all this language from the act and from the regulation. Okay, which was that you had to have that before as well. So that's the content of the educational services contract. Then section 21 is really for formation professionnelle et l'enseignement collégial. Okay, so we don't need to go over that. Then you have changes to Annex A. Annex A is the information you need to provide when you do a permit renewal or permit modification. Okay, for those of you with obviously federal permits, it doesn't apply to you. I would say though, this is going to be my little crystal ball moment and my little sort of attempt at predicting where the ministry is trying to go here. Okay, and we'll look at the different changes that are being made to this section here. But and just to remind everyone, when you're doing a permit renewal process, you're only required to provide the information that's at point 1.1, at point 2, at point 5.2, and at points 6 to 10 of the annex. Okay, you don't have to send all the information that is required at from points 1 to 10. That's for somebody who's doing an initial application for a permit. If you're doing a permit renewal, you have a more limited amount of information you need to provide. But I find interesting that they have included in this. Let me just go to it here. That you are required to, the text here in blue, okay, at 10.2, this is something that you have to provide when you're doing a permit renewal. And you have to provide, indiquer les prix chargés aux étudiants ou aux élèves de la manière prévue par le paragraphe 6 de l'article 17.1 and 6 de l'article 17.1 is the following. Okay. You will now be required to include, let me just make sure that I'm at the right place. Yeah, 7.1, 6, in your educational services contract and in your offre de service, le prix total chargé par l'établissement et le prix détaillé selon la répartition suivante. Les droits d'admission d'inscription, les services éducatifs, tuition, educational services, les services accessoires, accessory fees, incluant le matériel didactique et équipement inclus. Dans le cas d'un établissement agréé aux fins de subvention, le montant de la contribution financière additionnelle pour un élève ou un étudiant qui n'est pas résident du Québec. So essentially, when I first read this, I sort of said to myself, oh, this is kind of nice. It's as though the Ministry of Education is sort of legitimating the process or the way that private schools have been constructing their educational services contract in recent years, which are in not so recent years, which is to have an amount for tuition and then an amount for all the accessory fees. And that's the way most of you have structured your contract for educational services, especially where you receive the subsidy. You include the amount of tuition, which is the base amount that you're allowed to charge, and then after that, the rest is the accessory fees. And so I said to myself, oh, this is great. The government is sort of saying, okay, they like this way of doing things. They like this way of structuring contracts and so on. And upon further thought, I'm thinking to myself that now that schools, when they do permit renewal, are going to have to provide, the exact details of all the amounts, prix chargé aux étudiants, et aux élèves de la manière prévue par le paragraphe 6 de l'article 17.1. I think that the government really here wants to have a very, very clear picture from all of you as to how much exactly you are charging to your first, to your students, to your parents. And I see this as a preliminary step, potentially, and again, this is just crystal ball stuff, but I see this potentially as a preliminary step towards then changing the law in a way to try and limit the amount that schools are going to be able to charge for accessory fees. So they're not changing the law. They're not telling you schools that, and this is mainly, comments that I'm directing towards schools that are subsidized. They're not saying here, okay, we're changing this regulation in such a way that you're not allowed to charge accessory fees, whatever. That, in my view, would require change to the law. Because it's the law that says that schools can charge tuition, educational services, an amount for education services, and an amount for accessories. So they need to change the law to change the way that is can be structured in your educational services. They're not doing that here, but I think that they're making sure they're going to collect all the data that they can get their hands on. And arguably, they already potentially had access to most of this, but now they're going to have you providing all this information to them every time you do a permit renewal process, and you say, okay, this is how much we charge for accessory services, this is how much we charge for tuition, blah, blah, blah. I think that then potentially the change to the structure into the law is going to come after that. Again, prediction. Yes, Yvette.
Sorry, Patrick, I have a quick question. Sorry if there's noise, I'm in a public space. I remember, I think, reading something about that we also have to mention what is not included in our contract. For instance, in our school is uniforms. That's for an example. Do you remember mentioning something about what is not included?
About mentioning what is not included?
Yeah, or somebody else in this meeting.
Let me go back to.
I think Yvette, on page, what page is this? 515 in section 5, where it talks about services accessoires, there's a line at the end that says ceux qui ne sont pas fournis par l'établissement ou qui ne sont pas compris dans les prix.
Yes, yeah. Exactly.
Mm.
That's right. So here.
Okay. Yeah. So we do have to mention.
Yeah. Ceux qui ne sont pas fournis par l'établissement qui ne sont pas écrits dans les prix visés au paragraphe. What? No. I mean, you're talking about uniforms. I'm not sure that uniforms would fall under matériel didactique et l'équipement. Certainly not manuel scolaire. So matériel didactique, that's for me is, for example, if you require iPads or something like that. L'équipement for me is any materials that people, sporting equipment, whatever, and equipment for like science classes or anything like that. I'm not sure that I don't think that uniforms would be included.
So for some schools that don't have the textbooks included, they would need to mention that it doesn't include textbooks. That's right. Didactic.
That's right. Okay. So coming back then to what you are required to provide in the context of a permit renewal, I have highlighted in blue those sections that mention, the information, the documentation that you're going to be required to provide in that context. And so, when it'll come time for permit renewal, you'll just have to satisfy the requirements and then provide this information. I find that there's quite a bit of new information is going to have to be provided, but I don't think we need to go through it in detail here. You have it in the draft regulation. But the main point that I wanted to make is that I think that they're trying to get as much information with a view to maybe eventually changing the law. But
Patrick, do you feel that there is room for, in a comment or the feedback piece, room for pushback on that? We can always mention it, but they're not necessarily going to do anything. But do you think it would be
to comment on what, Holly? I'm sorry.
Just to push back on the request that the schools be providing all that information when, in a sense, the ministry has access to most of it anyway. I mean, we're just making their job easier.
Exactly. I mean, the ministry has access to so much of your information at this point, but this is, as you said, exactly, it's just making it easier, more structured for them to receive this information. Personally, I don't think that this is something that they would be open to discussing. I think I don't think we're going to get much traction.
I thought it was interesting as well that they included the little line at the end about your international students as well.
Yes. Yeah.
Definitely.
No, and I think that with this regulation, I mean, I don't see this regulation as being some kind of like frontal attack on English private schools or anything. Like I see this as being a regulation where they're trying to address a number of concerns that they've had, and as Holly mentioned, with more international sort of type organizations, I think there's a lot of concerns that have been raised there. Other types of schools, I don't see this as necessarily being a regulation that is, pointing the finger at you guys so much. It has consequences, it has effects on you, but I don't see this as being something that is necessarily any form of attack on QAS schools per se. Oh, you're on mute, Holly.
Of course I am. If nobody else has questions about that section in particular, I had a quick question about section 14.
Section 14.
Just based to ask about this. And thank you for your crystal ball take. I think schools are already, looking at the role of subsidies down the road if they're currently subsidized. I know it's something on everyone's mind, so good to have that. Hey, so the question about section 14 is it required only for non-subsidized schools?
Yeah, because the security is only for non-subsidized schools.
Okay.
Yeah, because here it says how a student yeah, that's for when the security is actually going to be used. By the ministry to reimburse.
Just to let people know, I've thrown some highlights as Patrick's been talking into the chat. If you want to be able to, report back to anyone quickly and just kind of pull out those comments, you can actually download the chat by clicking on the 3 dots next to the smiley face, and it should give you an option saying save chat. Good. If not, those comments will be included in my notes afterwards, so we will be getting them.
Are there any other questions? I hope this was useful. It was a quick analysis and quick take of this regulation. So, you know, I'm sure there's maybe other comments or questions or things that come up over time, and feel free to submit those to Holly, and we'll take a look at that.
Thank you everyone for being available. Like I said, we really try not to book on a holiday. I know some people are away on Passover, but when we do, it's because there's a, you know, an urgent need there, and we try to make sure that everyone has access to the information after the fact, so that they're not missing out. So as Patrick said, if you have any other questions, please get in touch. Feel free to send them my way. Patrick, you and I have sent you a couple of messages just outlining the things that you have flagged, so we can follow up on that. And wishing everyone a good break and power restored quickly if you don't have it. Hang in there, folks.